Right. We're all set.
Yes, and I can already see that there are approximately 15 attendees. We have close to 100 registrations. I am not entirely sure how many are going to be on live right now, but the event is also live on Facebook. So if you are not able to register for this talk on Zoom, you can just go to our facebook.com/Prinseps. It's live there as well. So a bunch of options. Regarding questions, given the number of attendees, we decided that having an open chat would be a bad idea. So questions, if any, can be WhatsApped to a couple of numbers. One of them being, sorry. Yeah, guys, can you just send me your WhatsApp numbers? I'll just repeat that in a minute or two. So questions can be WhatsApped and we'll be happy to answer them either during the call or afterwards. Again, the number of attendees and, fearing frequent interruptions, we decided to not have a live chat session. Again, this is also being streamed live on Facebook. Well, Partha, thank you very much for joining us and having a chat on Atul Bose and modernism. I'll start by repeating the same things as I said when I first had a chat with you yesterday, that I'm quite jealous of your bookshelf behind you, and hopefully we'll be able to get a list of some of the interesting books.
Okay, yes.
You mentioned last time, a lot of people actually use props these days in their Zoom call, which we tried to see if we could have some sort of a background with props, but unfortunately we weren't able to figure out how to do it. So we'll have to
my books are genuine. These books actually are genuine.
So we'll have to go with our wallpaper background, which is different from yesterday. Yesterday it was a crane. Today it's more like a Gerhard Richter's stripes. So from a look east Japanese inspired wallpaper, we've gone to more contemporary. So still an art setting, but a little different. The number, guys, in case anybody wants to WhatsApp, is 98100-53345. Again, 98100-53345, or 98. I can't read the second number. Anyway, 98100-53345. You guys can WhatsApp me as well in case any questions are there. A lot more attendees joining. I hope Zoom is qualified not to crash. So we'll have to keep our fingers crossed. Well, so we're discussing here about Atul Bose and modernism. I think it makes sense to start with the cultural environment or the political environment present somewhat before the formative years of Atul Bose that leads to the whole development of modernism and Bengal School. I mean, so can you, talk a little bit about, Ripon, Ilbert? I mean, you had family who was active at that time, Havel, Government College of Art, just generally.
There are two aspects. One is the actual artistic revolution. So that's the cultural and social aspect of artists and how they changed. The other aspect, of course, is nationalism, our struggle for independence. And that starts, well, Congress Party was founded in 1885, I think. And by about the 1870s, 80s, or even a little earlier, people, a lot of the they're Western educated, but educated people began to think about their own status within the Raj. They were subordinate in many ways, but there was a kind of interaction of various kinds. But as they began to become much more Western educated, and also they were allowed to, but also prevented from competing for jobs with the British who were in India. And ISIS was one of the important posts. British boys were always welcome. First Oxbridge and then ISIS exam and so on. Indians were given, I mean, Victoria proclaimed that everybody was equal under her, but when it came to the crunch, what the British did was to put the brakes on. So, all right, you can have a few, but there are two examples, let me tell you. The very first civilian ISIS, of course, was Satyendranath Tagore, Tagore's oldest brother. He was the very first ISIS. And one celebrated case, Surendranath Banerjee, wanted to join the ISIS, but again, what was felt that there are too many, particularly Bengalis, competing for ISIS, which wasn't seen in a good light. So Surendranath Banerjee went to England. He was failed several times, but he persisted. He passed, including, but he first failed, I think, riding, and then he passed all this. And this wasn't seen in a good light. When he came to India and got his post, it was one of the early posts. I don't know what he was, magistrate or whatever. Within a few months, he was dismissed for kind of sort of irregularity, which was, I think it was trumped up charge. So he, of course, he was forced out, and he became the first kind of moderate nationalist, one of the stalwarts of the Indian National Congress. So that was the beginning. But there was always this aspect that whenever the broad brush, I mean, the British government or the imperial government would say, yes, all Indians, if they're capable, would be allowed to join high status jobs. But often this was resisted. The other thing was, yes, there are two elements I must quickly tell you. Conservatives looked towards the peasants, and after the so-called mutiny about the First War of Independence, the British conservatives began to rather appreciate the Maharajas and Nawabs. They said they are our proper allies, so we mustn't take away their estates and their properties. So they became very important. So the Rajas, traditional rulers, and the traditional peasants, they're the ones Tories were very keen on to maintain their hold on the empire. The liberals, on the other hand, wanted to westernize Indians. Macaulay was very much in favor of English education. And then the promise was that if you get educated in English, you will be allowed to compete for high jobs. Because what happened was, the two levels, the lower levels, all manned, as it were, by the Indians. All the upper echelons were held by usually the British, but also Indians began to compete. Like the great novelist Bankim Chandra, very competent. He could not go beyond, rise beyond deputy magistrate. And that was to his utter regret. Whereas a young lad from Cambridge comes and becomes his overlord, and he is the magistrate. So that kind of thing was very, very galling to the Indians. So this was the background. Excuse me. But also, in an interesting way, English language brought the whole of India together, because Benedict Anderson, the political scientist, talks about imagined community. First time the whole of India is seen as one. The railways, English language, all these aspects, and also print technology, books, magazines, journals, newspapers, both in English and vernacular, were spreading ideas about nationhood. So that is the background. While this was going on, And I have to say this, that gradually in Europe, particularly Britain, but other places as well, racism was slowly on the increase. And after the Indian War of Independence, racial, you might say even hatred amongst the British began to be very strong, and certainly a kind of new arrogance. So you see, that actually made, I mean, in a way, Indians were seen as inferior. However, when you look at, the British Empire, what was the foundation, economic foundation? Industrial Revolution. The first factories and other, all this setup, they produce steel. They also produce this cheap Manchester fabric, the cotton fabrics and so on. But by mid 19th century, a lot of thoughtful Englishmen, uh, British, you might say, even Scottish as well, they began to worry about the industrial age. And there was a kind of disillusionment. Ruskin was a great figure. He was very much against the industrial, how all the cities were being destroyed. And the whole British society was entering into a terrible period of crisis. So while this was going on, excuse me, there was a general kind of feeling that West was overreaching itself. It is facing a lot of crisis. So you had a whole range of thinkers who were rather, critical of the West. And also, this actually also was accompanied by a new perception of ancient Indian literature, philosophy, and civilization. Sanskrit. Goes back to late 18th century, but by mid 19th century, lots of Indian texts were translated, but the whole comes to a head climax with Swami Vivekananda appearing in Chicago in 1893, and he actually wowed the American audience. They thought they had never heard somebody so charismatic and so wonderful. So setting up eventually Ramakrishna Mission, uh, certainly Vivekananda was a great world figure. So you see this kind of restoration of confidence of, let's say, the Hindus, because they had been deeply insecure. So this was going on. That is the background against which art also began to be affected. I mean, you have a new way of looking at art. But here I have to go back to something. Now, again, mid 19th century, the British Raj decided that, they said that they had to repay the Indians because they had benefited so much from all the raw material, all the wealth being exported to Britain. So they said, well, how shall we do it? We can't give them, this kind of wealth, but what we can do is give them the gift of science. And at that time, there was obsession with science of art. Even drawing was scientific. So that's one thing. The other thing was a lot of thinkers like William Morris and others were deep. They loved Indian, decorative art, by which I mean, handicrafts. They thought this was so wonderful and so unlike the British, rather goods in bad taste, industrially produced goods. So the government said, oh, what shall we do? So they set up one by one art schools in uh, Madras, now Chennai, of course, Bombay, Mumbai, and Calcutta, Kolkata, one by one, three, and then Lahore. So what happened was, it was very interesting. Although artisans were encouraged to join art school, they were being charged something like, I don't know, 15 annas or whatever, old coin, but they had no money to even pay that sort of amount. So they couldn't, and they couldn't follow it, the instruction in sort of semi-English. And what you had is, English literate boys began to fill the art school. And then, importantly, this was actually the art schools were influenced by the art school in London, South Kensington. But what the art school taught was when I say English drawing, I mean Western drawing. So you might say it is representation, naturalism, by means of life drawing, from the classical nudes, Greco-Roman nudes, or from they would have a man sitting on a stool, and the boys in Bombay, Calcutta, draw from them. So this was a very important art school. But and art schools began to teach students various genres, and new genre, which of course Atul Bose was very much part of that later on, oil painting of European kind. Early oil paintings in the company period really painted in the Indian manner, outline, fill in with colors. What the new arts school student learned was how to represent or do a portrait by having a sitter in front and gradually capturing the form, the expression, and generally, as all these standard European oil paintings are, it became very lucrative. Therefore, you had these early artists like Bestanji Bomanji in Bombay, and then you had Shoshi Hesh in Calcutta, and various other, artists. But the greatest figure in this was, of course, Raja Ravi Varma. Never went in art school. Princeling, he learned largely privately taught, and he began to develop a brilliant sort of, way, portraiture, gradually from traditional art to actual portraiture. He had been taught traditional art before, but having learned from certain European painters, he developed an amazing practice. So what then happens is that here you have very interesting social change. Earlier painters were artisans. They were tied to the patronage of the Maharajas or Nawabs, old aristocracy. They had no independent existence, low status, whereas Ravi Verma himself was a prince, but also actual artist status, became very, certainly became high. So artists are high status. I call these new artists gentlemen artists, because they are very much part of the middle classes. Their aspirations were very much of the elite. So these are the transformations that happened in India. And of course, the taste became Victorian totally. All the old houses, if you go to, you see a lot of old European paintings and sculptures. So this is the whole, you might say, just at the end of the 19th century, you have this kind of very strong Victorian Western naturalist academic tradition. That's what academic art is. Going back to the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance. As I told you about Vivekananda and others, nationalist movement began to emerge. You also have parallels. Havel arrives at late 19th century, late 19th century, arrives at the art school in Calcutta. Now, very interesting, Havel was influenced by William Morris. And Havel, originally when he was in England, had rejected Renaissance naturalism because he had gone back to medieval art. When he comes to India, he was in the right place. His view was that Indian art does not try to emulate real life based on what he said materialistic notion of art, So Indian art is spiritual. So he arrives in Calcutta, and as the head of art school, he decides to change art syllabus, art teaching. Oh, that time the students were so keen to learn Western art, and they just just went out on strike. The big, real trouble here at the art school in Calcutta. One thing I hadn't mentioned, portraiture was the most lucrative, but also landscape painting of the European kind also came to through the art school to India, as well as through European painters. Okay, um, so sorry, I need to go back. You see, in late 19th century, the first actually nationalist paintings were done by Raja Ravi Varma. He moved from portraiture to what I call history painting, trying to reimagine the past through our literature, the great epics. So Ravi Varma's portrayal of the epics became absolutely, it thrilled everybody from the Maharajas, the rulers, and as well as the British, to the very humblest, you might say Panwala, who would have his, Ravi Varma print. So this is the beginning of nationalism. Let me go back to Havel. Ravi Varma created a new language of nationalist art. Let's keep that in mind. Havel tries to change art teaching in Calcutta. And we had the whole big revolt. So at this time, he met Abanindranath Tagore. Now, what was happening, Havel, and there were others too, like Vivekananda's disciple, Sister Nivedita, Margaret Noble, and so on. They were all, 1906, Ravi Varma dies. I mean, his reputation was at its zenith. Within a year, he was totally kind of derided, rubbished as a colonial hybrid. And so that's the thing where you see the nationalist ideas are coming of a different kind. So when Havel met Abanindranath Tagore, he was very happy because he felt that he could do something about nationalist art with Abanindranath, because Abanindranath had already started to experiment with Indian miniatures, the Krishna Lila series, where he, tried to present an alternative vision of, Indian figures, very flat, done in a very much more a traditional, miniature way. And then he also did, I think it's 1903, at the Darbar exhibition, Shah Jahan, the last moment of Shah Jahan, where he deliberately used details from Taj Mahal and made his painting fairly flat, but not entirely, because he was still under the influence of, English art teaching methods. Anyway, he and Havel then began to plan or plot how to change this whole art school, approach. Incidentally, Havel auctioned off all the European oil paintings which had been given by various governor general and other worthies, and he sold them off and bought Mughal paintings like Mansour's The Crane, and so on. So at this moment, excuse me, let's think about 1905, a very important date. The partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon led to the first big unrest known as the Swadeshi movement. Swaraj and Swadeshi, self-rule and self-help. So against that background, Abanindranath, through Havel as his deputy, started to collect students to try and recover what he said, the lost language of Indian art, tried to create a new style. This, all the famous figures, Ashit Haldar, Nandalal Bose, so many, Shuren Ganguly, they're all there, K. Venkatappa, and through them, you had this very interesting group that began to develop a very consistent style, actually. So I would say between 1900 and 1920, the Bengal School of Painting, the first nationalist art movement in India, flourished. By 1920, Bengal School dominated the whole of English, Indian art schools and art scene. That became the dominant voice. And so this was the cusp. And one other thing, quickly, whether you have Ravi Varma or you have Abanunath, they were both trying to go back to the past, recreate the past, reimagine the past. So what was the difference? Ravi Varma painted in a Victorian academic mode, whereas for Abanunath and for Havel, it was not enough to go back to the epics. You had to have a proper language, which is indigenous. But now there's another complication. Abanunath himself wasn't very happy with the bright colors of Mughal painting. He liked the kind of hazy, subdued light. And one more equation I need to tell you. Around 1900, in Asia, particularly Japan and India, a new movement was coming into being, and not just art, but also intellectual movement called Pan-Asianism. Very important figures. They juxtapose West and non-West, or no, West and Asia, Europe and Asia. Europe was materialistic, yes, conquerors, but East was spiritual and in many ways superior, much more superior. Okakura Kakuzo in Japan was a disciple of Fenellosa, an American, and through him he began to restore Japanese indigenous art, and he also got in touch with Tagore. Rabindranath was a very important figure in Pan-Asianism. He came to live with the Tagores in India. He wrote his book, Ideals of the East, at Jorashako, and through them, a new idea about Pan-Asian, particularly the whole of Asia is one. This kind of Pan-Asian doctrine began to take shape. Now that had impact on art very strongly. Okakura actually was an art theorist and an artist. His two important figures, students, Taikan and Hishida, came to Calcutta and they lived with the Tagores. So Abanunath and Taikan worked together very closely. Taikan learned Mughal painting, but Abanunath learned Japanese morutai, wash technique, and that became the foundation. Now you have this kind of different elements, the flat surface of non-Western art, but particularly earlier miniatures. Then you have this atmospheric, colors of Bengal school, and perspective is also not the single point perspective, European one, but simply things often floating in space. And it was also Ariel's perspective of Persian and Mughal art. So all this come together to create this hazy, very misty, in some a beautiful range of colors of Abanunath and his pupils. So that's the background of this whole nationalist art initially, going back to the past, the heritage and pan-Indian past. And that's something you wanted to recreate through this kind of mixed style, Japanese and Indian, which is Oriental. It's Oriental art, not Indian art as such. Whole Asia is one, as I said. So this went on until the 1920s. Then other things started happening, very important. And now, what we usually think of modern art as, immediately you think of what? Picasso?
More
Sorry.
time to discuss before you go into the specifics.
Okay, sure.
Some the definitions of formal modernism versus
That's what I was coming to.
right. Okay, and then okay, fine.
Now, in 1922, actually, is a very important date. The German School of Design, Bauhaus, through Rabindranath's invitation, came to show in Calcutta the great figures, Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and all the rest of the people. Very important date. But what's happened is interesting. From early 20s, ideas about modernism, Picasso, etc., began to come, filter down to India. It was gradually spreading. Now, what is modern art? I mean, we always think of modern art as Picasso or similar, artists. What is a special thing? European modernism, their main enemy was academic art. And they rejected this this kind of illusionism, things look real, of academic art. If you think of Victorian painting, Victorian painters want to create this illusion of reality, absolutely lifelike. And all these painters gradually, Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, you name Gauguin, Van Gogh, Cézanne, then on to Cubists, on to Expressionists, they were all rejecting academic naturalism. So it's the formal aspect. They were interested in a kind of formalist line and shape and planes and colors. Going back to the purists with Mondrian, the Dutch painter, but there were others, Also distortion. Cubism believed in distortion and dissolution of object. If you paint a human being, it begins to disintegrate. This is why you see in Picasso, for instance. Now, that was a very powerful influence in all over the world. The syntax of modernism, of cubism, became attractive to a lot of painters all over the world. That is the very interesting aspect of European modernism. And Gauguin, of course, became very interested in Cubism, and his early Cubist period was very, very powerful. So that's one aspect. The other aspect was that gradually, this has partly to do with, you might say, nationalism. People moved towards, you might say, the countryside. You find this is an interest.
Formal modern. You had previously defined formal modernism in terms of the Indian context. So before we move over,
No, but also European context. It's very European. All formalists. You look at the range. I mean, Cubism, distortion of objects, disintegration. You look at the Expressionism, going back to so-called primitive art, and trying to paint and draw human beings as if they're not really like child art. Child art, primitive art, and other forms of art became the great ideal. So that, sorry.
African masks. I mean,
Yeah, I'm losing a little bit of your sound, but anyway, so that spread. I would say that also spread to India indirectly, not in terms only of the formal side, but also of the idea. I have to explain primitivism a little bit. Primitivism is all different kinds. One is European kind of, you might say, consumption, control of the primitive, objectifying, They're wonderful, but then do they have any existence? That's one thing. There is another form of primitivism, and that has nothing to do with Africa and other places. That is, if you look at 19th century, a whole range of people, Romantics in particular, their primitivism was simply anti-industrial society. You have to go back to that pristine purity of simplicity, you see. And this is something you find also used as a political instrument by Amrita Shergill, with her use of the village and the kind of, a different image. But Jamini Roy, going back to the village and village art, but as a political statement of collective art. So these are the aspects of modernism that spread all over India. Of course, poor Bengal school gets
You
it in
mentioned
the neck.
Rabindranath Tagore as well. So you mentioned Rabindranath
Oh,
Tagore's.
very, very important. Yes, sorry, absolutely. I mean, his own works are playful use of primitive motifs, but Shantiniketan, I call it environmental primitivism. Why? Because you are trying to uh, create this notion of the community and the unity. I mean, Ramdas was very much against schooling, colonial schools. He hated it, and Shantina was trying to create a holistic human being, and in the community, and
Excuse
that
me, interrupting
creativity.
Partha. There's an important book by Rabindranath Tagore called Parrot's Training, and it's actually a
Oh
parrot
yes, 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 yes,
system, and
yes.
about
Yes.
how colonial education is just teaching all of us to be parrots.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, he was very against it. He was scathing. So many. I mean, I've written about it in another connection. Yes, absolutely. All his things about we only teach people boys and girls to say, something, repeat, mimic, parrot, but we have no personal, any creative ideas. I mean, he felt he was a prisoner at school. Very interesting. I mean, yeah, absolutely. So idea of creativity, childlike creativity, idea of freedom, the way you live in an environment. So when he founded Shantiniketan, he was very keen to create an art school which would, represent these ideas. And Kala Bhavan was his idea, and he particularly invited, or you might say enticed, Nandalal Bose to come and join him. And Nandalal created this, forged this very important movement in Shantiniketan of the sort of, I call it primitivism, you might call it radical nationalism, but environmental, very much environmental in those days, so many years ago. We're now talking about environment and ecology, but I mean, it was started by Rabindranath Tagore. So this was going on. But what then happened was poor Bengal school, the original one of Nationalism, came, and that came to collect a lot of flack. Everybody was kind of attacking it. I mean, a whole lot. I mean, Shergill spent a lot of her time and her short life attacking Bengal school. Why? This is why it's an interesting idea. I don't think it's, let's say, let me explain to you. Not Bengal school, as well as their critic Amrita Shergill, believe that there's such a thing as authentic Indian art. I don't believe so. There's no such thing. I mean, what is authentic? There's so many different kinds of art, and art thrives on hybridity. That's one of the things. Continuous exchange of ideas. But this is a nationalist trope that you had to create a pure, authentic form of art. So the whole contention became, Ravi Varma was totally unauthentic. That's why he was terrible. So Bengal school is authentic. And then Shelgi then, claims. So the whole debate became between, can academic painting or traditional academic artists, can they be patriots? Can they be authentic? And there's wonderful debate and scathing articles by Suresh Samachpati and others in Shahitya attacking Bengal School and Bengal School attacking them. It was wonderful. So this was going on. I mean, fierce debate about what is actually Indian art, you know. Um, so that's how it was going on. One small thing, they all talk about Indian art as spiritual. What does that mean? Well, it goes back to the our colonial Raj, the high officials. They wanted to inspire Indians in Victorian academic art, like Ravi Varma. And to them, Victorian history painting, you know, these big historical scenes of Alma Tadema and others, history painting was the ultimate. Mughal painting, they knew. They say it's very nice, it's very beautiful, but it doesn't, it's a second class art. But why? And that's the interesting thing. Why? Because um, they're decorative. Now, decorative doesn't mean just decoration, it means flat lines and colors. So um, the whole contention became Havel and others talk about Indian art. Yes, Indian art is spiritual. Why? Because it's decorative. Why decorative? It's flat in its kind of treatment. So that became the kind of big stick to beat academic art with. All this is happening in the 1920s, early, up to